Well, greetings, church family. Today's daily Bible reading was from Genesis 20 and 21. And as we begin Genesis chapter 20, we see that Abraham is reacting to the terrible destruction by the hands of the Lord as he poured out his wrath on Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham saw that, if you remember, in Genesis 19, verse 27, 28. He sees the destruction rising like smoke from a furnace, it says. And so what happens? Chapter 20, he journeys from there. He gets away from the land. There's a fearfulness behind his departure, and he goes towards the land of the Negev. So he sees the destruction, and he actually flees where God had placed him, the land that his descendants would indeed one day have. And what he does when he flees to the Negev, Negev is the Hebrew word for south, or can mean south country. Here it's referring to the arid terrain that's just south of the Judean hills. And he specifically goes, verse 1 of chapter 20 says, to Gerar, which was a city in Philistine country. So he fled where he was from and went to the land of the Philistines. And in verse 2, what does Abraham do? Really interesting. Remember, this is the chosen one that God has selected to bless people from every tribe and tongue and nation across the world through this man, through this man's descendants is going to happen. This covenant that he's made with Abraham. Look what Abraham does. He's listed as a faithful man throughout Scripture, and yet we see still very human, still has that depravity that we all have, that sinful nature. What does he do? He lies about his wife, says that Sarah is my sister, and what he's implying there is that Sarah is not my wife, as we see later on. They actually are close relatives. But he's trying to get away with her being his wife in a foreign land. He's fearful of his life, and that should sound very familiar to you because it's the exact same ploy that he tried in Egypt 25 years before in Genesis 12. Instead of trusting the Lord in his sovereign will, remember, God had promised in Genesis 18 that Sarah would give birth to Abraham's son. And instead of trusting the Lord, Abraham tries to take matters into his own hands, and he lies. What do we see in verses 3 through 7? We see something very interesting. Abimelech, this Philistine king in Gerar, he took Sarah, but God actually appears to him in a dream. He graciously keeps Abimelech, this Philistine king, from sinning in this manner. And Abimelech couldn't help but refer to him as Lord. He had to see, he recognized that this one speaking to him in a dream, verse 4 here, is indeed Lord. In verse 7, we see the first use of the Hebrew word for prophet, navi, in all of Scripture. Therefore, restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet. Abraham listed by the Lord as a prophet. And Abimelech obeys right away, doesn't he? Verses 8 through 10. He obeys right away. He actually rebukes Abraham. How humiliating, humbling that would have been for the Lord's chosen one, Abraham, to be rebuked by this Philistine king who doesn't even worship Yahweh, rebuked for his sin. How could you bring on me and my kingdom a great sin, verse 9 says. Abraham had committed this sin because he feared his life, didn't he? And that's what he tells Abimelech. Surely there's no fear of God in this place. They'll kill me because of my wife. He uses this excuse that this is the reason. He fears his life. And he tries to actually squirm away. And the sad thing is he brings his wife into his sin with him. We're seeing this theme over and over, aren't we, in Scripture? The truth about sin is that it affects and really infects others. Others who are already depraved, of course. We all have our sinful nature. And yet, when we are around sinful company, there's an impact of sin on us. And when we sin, it impacts other people. And it can cause them to stumble as well. We see this truth over and over throughout Scripture. Well, in the end of chapter 20, we see that God pulls back on this curse that he had given to all of Abimelech's house, to his wife and his maids. They're able to now bear children again. He had closed their wombs when Abimelech took Sarah to be another wife of his own. And then we fast forward a little bit in chapter 21, and what do we see? God keeps his promise, doesn't he? Yeah, he keeps his promise. Sarah conceived, verse 2, and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. Love this. At the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. God's in control. God's sovereign, and God always keeps his promises. His plans will always come to fruition, unlike our own. Isaac here, you may know, means God laughs, or Yahweh laughs. And, the name is not meant to kind of poke fun at Sarah necessarily. Abraham names him, right, calls him Isaac, circumcises his son according to the Abrahamic covenant which God had made with him. But just think of it this way. It's very interesting. In Genesis 17 and 18, both Abram and Sarai had laughed when told, oh, I'm going to give birth in this old age. How in the world is Sarah going to bear Isaac? How is this going to happen? They both had laughed when told that God would give them a child. And that laughter was one of disbelief, wasn't it? This laughter here, this laughter that they're referring to, as Sarah says, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Well, this laughter is more of a joyous laughter. It's more of a, look what God did. Look how he kept his promise. This birth of this boy between the two in their very old age, Abraham being 100 years old, it says in verse 5 of chapter 21, when this happens. And it shows for them to see that the Abrahamic covenant is going to continue now through Isaac. This is that one that the Lord has chosen. We'll actually see that when we look at chapter 22 tomorrow. Well, Sarah ends up kicking out Hagar here for good. Remember, she did that before on a temporary basis, and God sends Hagar back and has Abraham take her back into their encampment. But Sarah saw Hagar, she offended her, doing some sort of mocking or playing, it is in the Hebrew, and Hagar leaves with her child. Remember Ishmael that we saw earlier. And Sarah had kicked her out for good this time. But once again, what do we see? God graciously protecting Hagar and her son Ishmael. He provides for them, and he purposed to make Ishmael into a nation. He actually says that, doesn't he? God tells Abraham this. I'm going to make a nation, in verse 13, of this son of the maid, because he's your descendant. Because of that promise he made to Abraham, he's actually going to keep a partial of it through Ishmael. In verses 22 through 34, kind of finishing off this chapter here, after we see God protecting and providing for Hagar and Ishmael, we see the first ever recorded, at least in Scripture, human-to-human covenant recorded. We've seen the Noahic covenant, God making that covenant with Noah and with the whole human race, and then the Abrahamic covenant, God making a covenant with Abraham and then all of his descendants, as we're going to see through Isaac, and then later on narrowed through Jacob, right, who has his name changed to Israel. But here we see the first human-to-human covenant as Abimelech, that king in Philistia, and his commander of his army, Phicol, make this covenant with Abraham. And in this covenant we see involved an establishment of property, being a well that was dug, but it would also typically include some sort of promise of military protection and to not raid each other's camps and things of that sort. So we see this at the end. What are the principles that we get from these two chapters? What do we see that is true? Well, we see that God is gracious, don't we? We see that God is so incredibly gracious towards Abraham and Sarah. He does not punish them, even though they lied. Once again, they lied, just as they had done 25 years ago in Egypt, back in Genesis 12. They lied once again, and yet God is so gracious to them. He does not punish them for that lie about their marriage. He also extends his common grace towards Abimelech and his household, and towards Hagar and her household. And that's fascinating to see, that God extends common grace towards all those made in his image. Even now, God extends his common grace towards those who were not his people, by the mere fact that unbelievers are living one more day here on earth rather than suffering from his wrath for eternity already, by the mere fact that they can enjoy a certain amount of happiness, a certain amount of joy, seeing the beauty of God's creation, being able to interact with one another, and so on and so forth. We see his common grace enacted even at this time. God is so incredibly gracious, at the same time as being wrathful, as we just saw yesterday, against sin and against sinners. And God keeps his promises, doesn't he? That should never, ever, ever be a doubt for us. God keeps his promises. He keeps his word no matter what. We just need to celebrate that fact. All his promises in Scripture are true. How should we respond to these two chapters today? We need to trust God. We need to trust God more. We need to behold him more. We need to take him at his word. We need to trust what he has said, what he has placed for us in his Holy Bible. And we need to obey him, obey his word. Dear Christian, even when you fear your life, even when we fear our lives, unlike Abraham and Sarah's lie, we need to obey. They disobeyed. We need to obey the Lord, even when we fear the unknown. And we need to thank God for the gift of his Son, Jesus Christ. After all, God is gracious, as we see in these passages. And what does Titus 2:11 remind us? That the grace of God was revealed in his Son, Jesus Christ. That is the most tremendous showing of God's love that we have, is in his Son Christ. Turn to him, trust in him, worship him this day. Hope this was a great benefit for you, and I hope that you have a great day.